When my stepmother staged a break-in to frame me, she didn't expect the police would find evidence against her instead, and I never expected my summer break to turn into a full-blown nightmare. But looking back, maybe I should have seen it coming. My stepmother, Victoria, had always made it painfully clear that she never wanted me around, but I thought I could tough it out for a few months before heading back to college. My dad, Mark, was the only reason I even came home at all, though I should have known better than to expect him to actually have my back when it really mattered. He never had before, so why would this time be any different? From the moment I walked through the front door, I could feel the tension thick in the air, the way Victoria's perfectly manicured nails gripped the edge of the kitchen counter just a little too tightly when she saw me standing there. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said something about how nice it was to have me back, but I could hear the strain in her voice. My stepbrother, Mason, barely even looked up from his phone before rolling his eyes and muttering under his breath, probably already counting the days until I left again. That first week back was unbearable, with Victoria constantly hovering, nitpicking every little thing I did, acting like I was some unwelcome guest instead of Mark's daughter. She made snide comments about my clothes, my hair, even the way I set the table, as if I was intentionally trying to ruin her aesthetic. Mason, of course, found the whole thing hilarious, always smirking behind her back, knowing that no matter what, she'd take his side over mine. The night everything went to hell, I had been out with Jenna, my best friend since middle school, just catching up over coffee. It was late when I finally got back, and the second I stepped onto the porch, I knew something was off. The front door was slightly ajar, the deadbolt clearly broken, the entire house eerily silent in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. My stomach twisted as I pushed the door open further, my breath catching when I saw the chaos inside. Furniture was overturned, drawers yanked open with their contents spilled onto the floor, picture frames shattered, glass crunching beneath my shoes as I stepped further into the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I took it all in, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The sound of hurried footsteps made me freeze, and before I could even react, Victoria came rushing down the stairs, her face twisted in panic, her voice shrill as she called for Mark. "She's here," she shrieked, her wild eyes locking onto me like I was some kind of intruder. "Oh my God, I can't believe you actually came back." Before I could even ask what the hell was going on, Mark appeared, his face pale and drawn, his phone already pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed, frantic tones. Behind him, Mason stood with his arms crossed, looking more smug than shaken, which set off alarm bells in my head. Something wasn't right, and I had the sickening feeling that whatever was happening had nothing to do with me being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police arrived minutes later, red and blue lights flashing through the windows as officers flooded the house, asking questions, surveying the damage, trying to piece together what had happened. Victoria played the role of the devastated victim flawlessly, clutching Mark's arm, fake tears running down her cheeks as she recounted how she had come home to find the place ransacked. Then, she turned to me, her expression shifting into something colder, something calculated. "She must have done this," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "She was angry, she wanted revenge, and now she's trying to act like she had nothing to do with it." I swear, for a second, time stopped. The accusation hit me like a slap, my mind racing to make sense of what she was saying. Revenge? For what? Being treated like garbage since the day she married my father? I looked at Mark, expecting him to shut this down, to tell her she was being ridiculous, but the doubt in his eyes nearly knocked the air from my lungs. An officer approached me, his gaze unreadable as he gestured toward the staircase. "We're going to need you to come with us, just to answer a few questions," he said, his tone professional but firm. "Are you serious?" I snapped, my voice shaking. "You think I did this? You actually believe that I would trash my own house?" Victoria let out a dramatic sob, burying her face in Mark's chest as if she couldn't even bear to look at me. Mason smirked, clearly enjoying the show. And then, as if the universe decided things weren't bad enough, another officer walked in holding a small jewelry box. "We found this upstairs, inside her room," he announced, flipping it open to reveal Victoria's missing necklace, the one she had just finished telling the police had been stolen. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't seen that necklace in my life. Hell, I didn't even go into Victoria's room if I could help it. And yet, there it was, sitting in a box that had been conveniently discovered in my belongings. It was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from, my voice drowning in the sea of Victoria's performance, Mason's smug silence, and Mark's crushing disappointment. It didn't matter what I said. The evidence was right there. Someone had planted it, and whoever had done it had gone through a hell of a lot of effort to make sure I looked guilty. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths, my mind racing through every possibility. Someone had set me up, and I was going to prove it. I just had to figure out how. Sitting in that cramped, fluorescent-lit interrogation room felt like being trapped inside a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, my hands gripping the edge of the cold metal table while my mind ran in endless circles, trying to figure out how the hell I had ended up here. The officer across from me, a man who introduced himself as Detective Cole, didn't look particularly convinced of my innocence, though he wasn't outright hostile either, which I supposed was the only thing I had going for me at this point. He flipped through his notes with the kind of deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl, his eyes occasionally flicking up to study me as if he was trying to decide whether or not I was capable of ransacking my own home just for the hell of it. "You have to believe me," I finally said, my voice hoarse from the hours I'd already spent trying to explain myself to officers who seemed far more interested in Victoria's dramatic retelling of events than anything I had to say. I didn't break into my own house, and I sure as hell didn't steal a bunch of things just to hide them in my own bedroom, where they could be conveniently found the second the police arrived. Detective Cole leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, measured rhythm that made it impossible to tell what he was actually thinking. "You understand why this looks bad, right?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, as if he were speaking to a child who didn't quite grasp the consequences of their actions. "Your stepmother says you've always had issues with her, that you've been resentful for years, and now we have stolen items found in your possession, so you can see how this situation doesn't exactly work in your favor." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief at just how perfectly Victoria had orchestrated this entire thing, twisting reality into something so unrecognizable that even I was starting to feel trapped inside the version of events she had created. "You think I've been resentful?" I shot back, my fingers digging into the fabric of my hoodie to keep myself from slamming my hands on the table in frustration. "Of course I have. She spent years trying to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. But being resentful doesn't mean I would ever do something like this. And if you actually took a second to think about it, you'd realize how ridiculous this whole thing is." Detective Cole raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with my outburst, but not entirely dismissive either, which gave me the slightest sliver of hope that he wasn't as easily manipulated as my father had been. "Then tell me why your fingerprints were found all over the ransacked areas of the house," he said, flipping a page in his notebook before looking back at me expectantly. "If you weren't involved, how do you explain that?" I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm even though every part of me wanted to scream at the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Because I live there," I said, struggling to keep my voice level when all I wanted to do was slam my fists against the table until someone actually listened. "Of course my fingerprints are in the house, just like my fingerprints are probably on every single surface in my bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, and every other place I've touched since the last time someone cleaned. You're telling me the only fingerprints you found were mine? Not Victoria's? Not Mason's? Not my dad's? Just mine?" Detective Cole hesitated for a fraction of a second, so small that most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did, and that was all I needed to confirm that this entire thing had been a setup from the very beginning. "Listen, I know you're doing your job," I continued, leaning forward slightly, trying to find some crack in his professional detachment that I could pry open just enough to get him to actually consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the person crying about being a victim was actually the one pulling all the strings. "But if you really think I'm guilty, then you need to ask yourself why I'd be stupid enough to hide stolen jewelry in my own bedroom, where it would be the first place anyone would look. Detective Cole studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally closed his notebook and let out a slow breath that made it clear this case was turning into a much bigger headache than he had originally anticipated. "All right," he said, his voice measured, as if he was carefully choosing every single word before letting it leave his mouth. "Let's say, for a moment, that I believe you didn't stage this break-in. Who do you think did?" I didn't even hesitate before answering. "Victoria," I said, my jaw tightening as I pictured the way she had clung to my father's arm, fake tears running down her face as she spun her web of lies so effortlessly that even the police had fallen for it. She's been trying to get rid of me for years, and now she's finally found a way to do it without my dad questioning her motives. Detective Cole didn't react right away, but I could tell that something in my words had struck a nerve, because for the first time since this interrogation started, I could see the gears turning in his head. He didn't outright dismiss me the way the other officers had, and that small shift in his demeanor was enough to make me feel like maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to turn this whole thing around before Victoria got exactly what she wanted. "All right," he finally said, standing up and grabbing his notebook before nodding toward the door. "I'm going to need to verify some things, but for now, you're free to go. Just don't leave town, because this investigation isn't over." Relief flooded through me so fast that my knees nearly buckled as I stood, but I forced myself to stay steady, knowing that this was only the beginning of what was about to be the fight of my life. I had to prove Victoria set me up, and if the police weren't going to figure it out on their own, then I was going to make damn sure they had no choice but to see the truth staring them right in the face. The walk home from the police station felt heavier than any distance I had ever covered in my life, my mind replaying every single moment of the interrogation in an endless, suffocating loop that made it nearly impossible to think straight. Detective Cole hadn't outright accused me of lying, but he also hadn't let me off the hook completely, which meant that no matter what I did next, I needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Victoria was behind this entire setup before she had the chance to bury me completely. By the time I stepped through the front door, the house felt different, like it had absorbed all the tension and deceit that had played out inside its walls over the past few hours, and was now pressing it back onto my shoulders like a weight I couldn't shake. Victoria was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea in her hands, looking like the very picture of a grieving woman who had just endured some tragic, personal violation. She barely even glanced at me before turning her gaze back to the television, where a crime drama was playing as if she wasn't currently starring in her own real-life scandal. "I'm surprised they let you go so quickly," she said, her voice soft, her expression carefully composed, as if she was just making casual conversation rather than subtly reinforcing the idea that I was supposed to be guilty. "I thought they'd keep you longer, considering everything they found in your room." My fingers curled into fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to rip the self-satisfied smirk right off her perfectly made-up face. I knew what she was doing, trying to bait me into an argument that would make me look unstable, aggressive, irrational. All the things she wanted my father and the police to believe about me. If I snapped now, if I screamed or threw something or lost control, she'd have exactly what she needed to keep this twisted charade going. "I guess they realized how ridiculous your little performance was," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it, even though I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat like a warning. "Or maybe they just weren't as easily manipulated as you expected them to be." Victoria let out a soft laugh, shaking her head like I was some petulant child who didn't understand the rules of the world she had built around herself. "You always did have a flair for dramatics," she mused, setting her cup down on the coffee table before rising to her feet in one fluid, elegant motion. "But let's be honest here, sweetheart. The police don't believe you. Your father doesn't believe you. And by the time this is all over, you'll be lucky if anyone ever believes a word you say again." I clenched my jaw so tightly I thought I might crack a tooth, but I didn't let her see how deep her words cut, didn't let her know that she was twisting the knife exactly the way she had planned from the start. Instead, I turned on my heel and headed upstairs, my mind racing through every possible angle, every possible weakness in her plan that I could exploit before she had the chance to tighten the noose any further around my neck. The second I closed my bedroom door behind me, I pulled out my phone and dialed Jenna's number, my hands shaking slightly as I pressed it to my ear. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp with barely contained fury before I even had the chance to say anything. "Tell me you're okay," she demanded, the sound of rustling papers in the background suggesting she had been pacing around, probably working through every possible scenario, just like I had been. "Tell me they didn't actually charge you with anything, because I swear to God, I will march down to that police station myself and make sure they let me go," I interrupted, exhaling slowly as I forced myself to focus, to push down the panic clawing at the edges of my mind before it had the chance to swallow me whole. "But I don't know how much time I have before Victoria finds another way to screw me over. So we need to figure out what the hell she's really up to before it's too late." Jenna was silent for a moment, but I could practically hear the gears turning in her head before she finally spoke again. Her voice calmer now, but still laced with the same determination that had always made her my first and only real ally in this house of lies. "All right," she said, the sound of keys clicking in the background letting me know she was already pulling up whatever research she had been working on. "Then let's start with what we know, and more importantly, what Victoria doesn't want anyone to know." For the next hour, we pieced together everything we had, from Victoria's sudden obsession with getting me out of the house to the way she had played the perfect victim the moment the police arrived, as if she had been rehearsing the performance in her head long before the so-called burglary ever happened. Jenna dug into every trace of Victoria's past she could find online, pulling up old articles, social media posts, anything that might give us an edge, until finally, she let out a low whistle that sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, would you look at that?" she murmured, clicking on something I couldn't see but could already tell was going to change everything. "Turns out, your dear stepmother has been married before, and not just once, but twice. And in both cases, things ended in some seriously shady circumstances." I frowned, sitting up straighter as my pulse kicked up a notch. What kind of shady circumstances are we talking about? The kind where both of her previous husbands suddenly decided to liquidate assets and transfer everything into her name before mysteriously divorcing her and disappearing off the grid, Jenna said, her voice tight, with barely concealed excitement. "And get this, both of those divorces happened right around the time Victoria filed police reports about break-ins, missing valuables, and fraudulent financial activity." The pieces clicked together in my head so fast that I felt lightheaded, my breath catching in my throat as realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. "She's running a scam," I whispered, barely able to believe the words as they left my mouth. "She marries rich men, stages crimes to frame someone else, manipulates them into signing over their assets, and then gets rid of them once she has everything she wants. And guess what, sweetheart?" Jenna said, her voice dropping into something almost smug, like she had just cracked the final clue in a true crime documentary. "Looks like your dad is next on her list, which means if we don't take her down fast, you won't just be fighting to clear your name. You'll be fighting to make sure she doesn't leave him bankrupt or worse." I swallowed hard, my entire body thrumming with adrenaline as I realized just how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about me anymore, wasn't just about proving my innocence or getting Victoria out of my life for good. This was about making sure my father didn't end up like her other victims, discarded and ruined, left to pick up the pieces while she walked away with everything he had. And if she thought I was going to let that happen, then she had seriously underestimated just how far I was willing to go to stop her before it was too late. Knowing the truth about Victoria should have made me feel relieved, but instead, it only made the situation feel even more terrifying because now I understood exactly how dangerous she really was. It wasn't just about her hatred for me anymore, not just about her trying to kick me out of the house or frame me for a fake crime, because now I knew she was running a pattern, a calculated scheme that had ruined the lives of at least 2 other men before my father, and she was dangerously close to pulling it off again. Jenna and I had spent hours poring over the details, digging through old financial records, divorce filings, and even archived police reports, and everything we found only confirmed what I had already suspected. Victoria wasn't just manipulative. She was a professional at it, a woman who knew exactly how to stage chaos while keeping her hands clean. I sat in my bedroom, my laptop screen glowing in the dim light, my eyes scanning through the old court documents Jenna had sent over, each one more damning than the last. In both of her previous marriages, she had filed police reports almost identical to the one she had filed against me, claiming break-ins, missing valuables, and suspicious financial transactions, all of which conveniently led to her taking full control of her husband's assets before their relationships mysteriously fell apart. The pattern was so obvious now that I couldn't believe no one had put the pieces together before, but I also knew exactly why. Victoria knew how to play the system, knew how to spin a narrative so well that even the police didn't think to question her. Jenna's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and urgent, her excitement barely contained as she continued to read through the financial records she had managed to dig up. "Listen to this," she said, the sound of her fingers flying over her keyboard in the background. In her second marriage, she convinced her husband to take out a huge life insurance policy right before their break-in happened. And guess who was the sole beneficiary? My stomach twisted as I already knew the answer before she even said it, my hands tightening around the edge of my desk as the weight of it all settled in my chest like a brick. "Victoria," I muttered, my pulse pounding in my ears as the full realization of what she was capable of sank in deeper than ever before. She's not just scamming people out of money. She's setting them up so that when she's done with them, they don't have a way out. Jenna let out a low whistle, the sound dark and humorless, like she was just as horrified as I was, but trying not to let it shake her too much. "If she's following the same pattern now," she said, her voice dropping into something more serious, "then your dad is in way more danger than you think. And if we don't do something soon, she's going to bleed him dry before he even realizes what's happening." I dragged a hand down my face, forcing myself to think, to push through the panic and focus on what needed to happen next, because sitting here, just knowing the truth, wasn't going to help anyone. And if Victoria had gotten away with this twice before, then she already knew how to cover her tracks better than anyone. "We need to get proof," I said, already running through every possible way we could gather solid evidence before she had the chance to manipulate her way out of this again. "Not just old records, not just patterns from the past. We need something real, something current, something that will make the police see her for what she really is." Jenna was quiet for a second, but then I heard the sound of her tapping a pen against her desk, a habit she always had when she was deep in thought. "What about the security footage?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharper, more focused, like she had just latched onto something big. "The police obviously didn't find anything that pointed to an actual burglar. But what if we get our hands on the raw footage before Victoria has a chance to tamper with it?" It was like a switch flipped in my brain, the idea snapping into place so perfectly that I almost couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it before, and suddenly, everything felt just a little less impossible. "The neighbor," I said, already standing up and grabbing my jacket, my mind racing 100 miles an hour as I realized exactly who might have what we needed. "Mrs. Delaney has security cameras facing our house, and she's always talking about how she records everything just in case. If anyone has footage of what really happened that night, it's her." Jenna let out a sharp breath, like she was already ahead of me. "Then what the hell are you still doing on the phone?" she demanded, her voice filled with the kind of urgency that made it impossible to hesitate. "Go over there and get that footage before Victoria finds out you're onto her, because if she realizes what you're doing, she's going to find a way to bury it before you can use it against her." I didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, I was out the door and across the street, my heart pounding so hard that I could barely hear my own footsteps as I knocked on Mrs. Delaney's door, praying that she was awake and willing to help me before it was too late. The porch light flicked on almost immediately, and when the door finally opened, the elderly woman peered at me with a mix of curiosity and concern, her sharp blue eyes scanning my face like she could already tell something was wrong. "Sweetheart, what are you doing out here this late?" she asked, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she stepped back to let me in. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't bother easing into it, didn't waste time on pleasantries or small talk, because every second I spent standing here was another second Victoria had to cover her tracks. "Mrs. Delaney, I need your security footage from the night of the break-in," I said, my voice steadier than I expected despite the way my entire body felt like it was vibrating with adrenaline. "I think it's the only way to prove that I didn't do it, and if I don't get it soon, I might not get another chance." For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable, and I braced myself for the possibility that she might refuse, that she might not want to get involved. But then she nodded slowly, her mouth setting into a thin line. "Come inside," she said, already moving toward the living room where her computer was set up. "If what you're saying is true, then I think we both know exactly who we're going to see on that footage." As the files loaded onto the screen, my pulse pounded harder than ever before, my hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly that my knuckles turned white. And then, finally, the footage began to play, and the moment I saw Victoria sneaking into the house before the so-called break-in even happened, I knew that this was it. The proof I needed, the thing that was finally going to bring her down. Watching the footage play on Mrs. Delaney's screen felt like being in the middle of a psychological thriller where the villain had finally slipped up just enough to expose their entire twisted game. The timestamp in the corner of the video showed that Victoria had entered the house through the back door nearly an hour before I had even returned home that night, her movements precise, deliberate, like she already had every step of her plan mapped out in her head before she even set foot inside. She wasn't panicked, wasn't rushed, wasn't reacting to some unknown intruder the way she had claimed. She was calm, methodical, placing objects where she wanted them, pulling open drawers, knocking things over, setting the scene perfectly before finally walking upstairs with what looked like a small jewelry box tucked under her arm. I felt my stomach drop as I realized exactly what I was watching, the final puzzle piece clicking into place so clearly that I wanted to scream at the sheer audacity of it all. Victoria had staged everything. The overturned furniture, the missing items, the fake burglary itself. And then, just to make sure her plan worked, she had planted her own jewelry in my bedroom before calling the police and pretending to be the victim. The way she had weaved her narrative so effortlessly, the way she had manipulated every single person around her into believing it, made my skin crawl, and the fact that she had done all of this with such ease only made me wonder how many times she had pulled off something similar before. Mrs. Delaney let out a low whistle as she leaned back in her chair, shaking her head like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing either, though the sharp glint in her eyes told me she wasn't entirely surprised. "Well, would you look at that?" she muttered, clicking back through the footage to replay the most damning parts, her lips pressed into a thin line. And here I was, thinking your stepmother just had a flair for dramatics. But it turns out she's got a real talent for making people believe whatever suits her best. I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of her desk as I tried to process what needed to happen next. Because for the first time since this nightmare had started, I actually had something tangible, something that Victoria couldn't explain away with a well-timed sob or a carefully placed lie. The police had already been suspicious, or at least Detective Cole had been, and if I brought him this footage before Victoria caught wind of it, there was no way she could talk her way out of it this time. "Mrs. Delaney, I need a copy of this footage," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though my entire body was still humming with adrenaline, my mind already running through the next steps like a carefully constructed battle plan. "If I can get this to the police before Victoria realizes what I'm doing, I think I can finally prove that she set me up." The older woman didn't even hesitate, already reaching for a flash drive from a drawer in her desk, moving with the kind of efficiency that told me she had been waiting for a moment like this for a very long time. "You don't have to tell me twice," she said, plugging the drive in and transferring the files with a few quick clicks, her expression unreadable as she glanced back at me. "But you'd better move fast, sweetheart, because if your stepmother gets even the slightest inkling that you're onto her, I don't think she's the type to just sit back and let the truth come out without a fight." I nodded, stuffing the flash drive into my pocket as I stood, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, because I already knew she was right. Victoria wasn't the kind of person who went down quietly, not when she had spent years perfecting the art of making people believe exactly what she wanted them to believe. If I didn't act fast, she would find a way to twist this entire thing back in her favor, and if that happened, I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to dig myself out of the hole she had buried me in. The second I stepped out of Mrs. Delaney's house, I made a beeline for my car, barely registering the cool night air against my skin as I pulled out my phone and dialed Detective Cole's number, silently praying that he would actually pick up instead of making me wait until morning to show him what I had found. The call rang 3 times before he finally answered, his voice groggy, like I had just woken him up. But the second I told him I had evidence that proved Victoria staged the entire burglary, he was suddenly wide awake. "You'd better not be wasting my time," he said, though there was something in his tone that told me he was already intrigued, maybe even hopeful, like some part of him had suspected Victoria wasn't telling the whole truth, but hadn't had enough to go on to actually prove it. "If what you have is as solid as you're making it sound, then you need to get down to the station as soon as possible before she realizes you're onto her." I didn't even hesitate, already shifting the car into drive as I pulled away from the curb, my pulse hammering in my ears as I sped toward the police station, every second feeling like a countdown to something I couldn't quite predict. By the time I walked through the doors, flash drive in hand, Detective Cole was already waiting for me, his sharp gaze scanning my face before nodding toward an empty office, motioning for me to follow him inside. "All right," he said, shutting the door behind us before gesturing to the drive in my hand. "Let's see what you've got." I slid the flash drive across the desk, my fingers tapping anxiously against my thigh as I watched him plug it into his computer, my entire body on edge as the video file opened and Victoria's perfectly staged crime played out right in front of him. He didn't say anything for the first few minutes, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched her move through the house with the ease of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly how to make a crime scene look real enough to fool even the most seasoned investigators. When the footage finally ended, he let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair as he folded his arms across his chest, his jaw tight as he processed what he had just seen. "Well," he finally said, his voice lower now, more controlled, like he was already shifting into action mode. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting something this blatant, but this is enough to make a real case against her." Relief flooded through me so fast I thought I might actually pass out, my knees suddenly feeling weak as the tension that had been strangling me for days finally started to loosen, just the slightest bit. "So what happens now?" I asked, barely daring to believe that this nightmare might actually be coming to an end. Detective Cole's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze dark and focused, like he was already running through the necessary steps in his head. "Now," he said, standing up and grabbing his jacket, "we pay your stepmother a little visit and see how well she holds up when she realizes that the game is over. Have you ever dealt with someone so manipulative that they could twist any situation to make themselves look like the victim? If you were in my position, would you have gone straight to the police? Or would you have confronted Victoria first to see her reaction? Do you think people like Victoria eventually slip up and expose themselves? Or do they usually get away with their lies for years?"